There we go. So it was a rainy day here in May, and I woke up more anxious than you could ever imagine. My then girlfriend and I were getting serious. We were dreaming about the next phase and the next season, and I had a plan, and it was a bit of a diabolical plan, I might add. So the goal was this. I was going to take her on a day that she was supposed to work, and I'd called her boss earlier and said, hey, can you sort of trick her into giving the day off? Right? A good start to an engagement story is always built on a lie. And so could you trick her to giving this day off? We're going to drive south, and here's the goal. We'll go skydiving. She'll be so terrified, she will say yes to marry me. Then I will call my roommates. They will have a huge party, assuming she says yes, of course, and that'll be it. So that's my plan. Can you feel the anxiety? Everything has to go right. The perfect plan in mind. So sure enough, we drive south, but it's a rainy day, not going well. The clouds begin to lift, though, as we're getting close to the airport. I think, oh, okay, now I just have to convince her on a moment's notice that she needs to go skydiving. So I pretend like it's this idea, hey, wait a minute, we should go skydiving. And sure enough, my wife calmly says, all right, let's check it out. You're like, what? Who says that? Well, you realize why I had to put a ring on that finger when she says that. So I'm going, this would be the last test before engagement. So minutes later, we're going for it. The diabolical plan continues to unfold. And as awkward as it is, if you go tandem the first time, you realize you're strapped to another human. I didn't think about this. And so as I'm waiting, we hit the ground afterwards. She's maybe a little bit terrified in the wrong sense of mind. I'm thinking I could perfectly trick her into marriage in this moment. And sure enough, as she's unstrapping from the lap of another man, she says yes. So that's all I got this morning. Let's head home. That was the start of this crazy journey in our lives called marriage. Here's a picture of our family right now. And so things have changed just a little bit. As you can imagine, things get a little bit more complicated. Things get a little bit more complex in the process. And I love marriage. Let me just say that. I love marriage. We're going to laugh a little bit. This morning, Aaron threw me an easy topic, said just talk about marriage. So what you don't know is this is a 3-day seminar. We're going to be sleeping here the next few days. Hope you guys are ready to go. So we're going to buzz through this topic of marriage, but it is so close to my heart, so near and dear to my heart. Now, it can't be any more awkward than what Aaron talked about last week. So, it's a step up in that sense. Breathe a little bit. We're not going there again. But what I will say is this. When Aaron talked about this idea that it's easy to have sex before marriage and it can become hard to have sex within marriage, which is kind of mind-blowing if you're not married. You're saying there's no way that can be true. The same is true of time, of quality time. Remember when you were dating married people and you were like, oh, your friends are like, did you go off the face of the earth? All you wanted to do was be with that person. And then later in marriage, it's like, wow, how did we not find any intentional time together? And how many times that shifts in our marriage, that quality time that we have together. And guys, let's be honest, there's a lot that needs to be rewired in our brains and hearts when we think about marriage. And so we want to start down that path today. We want to talk about some paradigm shifts today. Now, I don't know the state of your marriage. I know in a room this size, there are marriages on the rocks, struggling. There are other marriages on fire. You just experienced huge breakthrough in your lives. Wherever you sit this morning, I believe God has something for you. God has something unique for all of us. We can all grow, and we are growing into the next phase, into the next season of marriage. But I want to give you a confession. After I fell into engagement, and my wife even more so fell into engagement, I had this idea. I had this idea that marriage was like a plus one when you get invited to a nice party or somebody else's marriage. Or like, oh, plus one, yeah, I'll write her name or I'll write his name in there. But marriage is not just a plus one. I thought if I could just bring my wife along on this grand adventure that I'm living, if I could just kind of bring her along as a plus one, then we'll have this adventure together. And God has reshaped and shifted, and I would even say rewired my view to say it's actually one God plus we, plus us. It is not a me plus one, it is one plus we. And that is what we've experienced in our lives. I hope to crack open some stories of that today. and the idea that if we enter marriage thinking about how I can be happy, how I can just bring another person along on this grand adventure, we are going to miss out on this great adventure that is marriage. And guys, let me be really, really clear with this. I've done a whole lot of adventurous stuff in my life. I've done some cool things and climbed peaks and rocks and, whatever else. I have done nothing near as adventurous as this journey of marriage has been. It has been an adventure. Now, first date, let me take you back to this. So zoom back from, engagement back to our first date. So the idea was to take her to a jazz club. I thought, oh, that's romantic. So we went to dinner. We are heading out to a jazz club. I kid you not, the phone rings and my wife looks at me, my then girlfriend, right, looks at me, kind of like this, I got to answer it. And so she picks it up, and I'm thinking, who answers a call on the first date? Well, 2 or 3 minutes into this, I think, I'm pretty sure she's talking to a dude in prison on the other line, or on the other end of this line. I'm pretty sure. So I'm like, what? And she's kind of giving me a look like, I'll explain later. I'm like, oh, I think you will. Like, this is kind of awkward right now. Like, what is happening? So as we get further into that date, she begins to express how she had followed along with her heart of empathy to just be a friend with someone who had life without parole. She'd been walking along already for years, and I enter this friendship midstream. And let me just say that I never would be in a relationship like that, a friendship with somebody who had life without parole, who was dealing with life behind bars, if not for my wife inviting me into that adventure. It is not me plus one. It has been one plus we. To see what God was already shaping and shifting in her life, and I just got invited into it. And those are some of the beautiful things that when we follow God into marriage, we get to experience together. And now Nate has been my friend for the last 12 years, but only because of the journey that my wife was already on. Here's our big idea today. A me plus one marriage will shrink, but a one plus we marriage will keep growing. Because it will keep maturing and deepening and growing. And I love being with older couples who look and smile and laugh at each other. They have so many years on us. When I say, why am I qualified to be on this stage today? I haven't been married all that long, just 11 years together, or 11 years of marriage, 12 years together. Not all that long, but here's what I know, is that God gives us this gift in marriage that many times we sabotage, and many times our humanity of two people rubbing against each other rubs each other like sandpaper, and yet God wants to use marriage in huge ways. I am so convinced in the beauty of marriage, more than I ever was. And unfortunately, I'm so convinced in my own selfishness, more than I ever was. And that is a beautiful collision that God is using in our lives. So let's look at what Ecclesiastes has to say about relationship. Here we go. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 to 12. Two are better than one, because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help them up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. So I want to show you a picture we believe so strongly in this idea, this verse, this concept. This has become our marriage verse together. This is my wife's wrist, and she has a cord of 3 strands in Arabic wrapped around her wrist. I have it on my shoulder. Not going to show you that right now, but just a reminder that this is God weaving our stories together. This is not a pulling apart. This is us coming together within marriage. And let me just ask you, who doesn't want these things in this passage? Number one, to have a greater impact together than you could have alone. Who doesn't want that? And by the way, marriage is not a 2x impact. It can be 100 or 1,000x impact. That's how God does it. Who doesn't want to have someone pick them up when they fall? Interesting, the disciples were also sent out 2 by 2, I believe, for this reason, that together they were more powerful. Who doesn't want to simply stay warm when you sleep? I'm not going to have you raise a hand if you have ever spooned on a cold night, okay? That's between you guys. What about frustrations? What about defending against fears in your life? What about the idea of I don't know what to do in life or I feel alone, and there's a companionship that God brings us within marriage? Now, what's interesting is when we're young, we see the benefits of marriage. Oh, I want the benefits of marriage, and there are many that you imagine in your mind, and yet you don't want the sacrifice of marriage. And I hope as we get older and the longer we're in marriage, and I'm learning from couples right now in their 80s who look at each other with that glimmer in their eye and say they have served and they have sacrificed well for years for each other. That's what I want. But let me just ask you this. If you want something good but you're not willing to invest in it, in what area of life does that work? I mean, can you think of any other area where you go, I want the good stuff, but I don't want it to be hard. I don't want it to be work. I don't want to have to push through anything uncomfortable. That doesn't work in life. It's called investment. And investment is based on delayed gratification. In what ways are you investing in your marriage relationship now? And if you're not yet married, in what ways are you investing in your relationship with God? Aaron talked about going without certain things right now, so that you can offer certain gifts to that other person when you are married. And let me just say, guys, the following passage that I'm going to read has been taken out of context so many times. It's been used even to abuse, to misuse, to put power over another person that God never intended. Now, let me just say this too. There's breathing room in a whole lot of things in marriage, but one thing there is zero breathing room in is this. We are to serve one another in marriage, to serve, to sacrifice for one another in marriage. So here we go. We're in Ephesians chapter 5, and let me just give you the context of this. Paul is talking about life and love to the church. How do we live well and how do we love well to the church in Ephesus? This was a constitutional document. This was kind of passed around, sent around to different churches. So this wasn't just written into the context of one church, but to explain how to live well. And what we forget many times, I've read this passage before at weddings, we forget many times that he's just talking about the church. He says, submit one to another before we get to this marriage verse. That as part of the church, the body of Christ, we are to submit with different gifts, different desires, different things God puts in us, different seasons. And so with that context of submitting one to another, we enter this part specifically about marriage. But I want you to look for something, trust. Look for this idea of trust, because without trust, there is no submission. And I would say without trust, there can be no love. Try to love someone you have zero trust for. Try to love someone you have zero trust for. So we start with that context of trust, the context of love, the context of the body of Christ. Here we go, Ephesians 5, starting in verse 22. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, as is himself its Savior. Verse 24. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, listen up. Verse 25. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he may sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church. Because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife. The two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Let me give a disclaimer. I know even as I read those words, many of you bristle at that thought. And let me just say this. There has been sloppy interpretation of that for many, many years. People have used that to say very hurtful things, to do very hurtful things, and even abusive things. And let me just say, if this verse has ever been used for you to think or do something abusive to your wife, two things are wrong. number one, you've twisted God's words. Marriage is something beautiful that involves sacrifice, that involves laying our lives down, husbands, for our wives as Christ loved the church. No pressure there, dudes. No pressure there if that's our example. Wow. And second, if you've ever used that verse to misuse, to abuse power or authority over a woman, then you don't understand Jesus. Jesus was the great dignifier of women. Look all throughout the Gospels. He's always bringing a dignity to women that culture didn't invite them into. He's lifting them up, not pushing them down. Jesus, the great dignifier. And unfortunately, we see all kinds of abuses that have come out in our culture with the Me Too movement, terrible abuses toward women, things that need to come out and need to be exposed that God is not okay with. And again, I know this can be a controversial passage, but let me talk about this for a second. This idea of head, guys, this is not about value. This is about order and about responsibility in relationship, about order and responsibility. And by the way, in this passage, I see a whole lot of call for the guys. I see not as many instructions to the ladies, but this massive call for men for us to serve our wives, to lay down our wives, not only to love as Christ loved the church, but as much as you love your own body, love your wife more. Your own body when you were exhausted to the bone and you want to sleep in, that we would think about our wives even more than that. Wow. What a call for us. Men, we need some rewiring. I need rewiring every morning when I wake up. And my kids remind me of that. If they wake me up earlier than I had thought, some ugly and even angry thoughts come out of me. Kids, go back to your room. I told you exactly what time you're waking up. And things like that come out in the selfishness of our lives. What would it look like to serve your wife, to lay down your life for your wife, to sacrifice? Maybe there are different areas of responsibility that you need to take. Men, we will be held accountable for whether we served and sacrificed for our wives or not. And that's humbling. No pressure there on Jesus' example. Now, women, let me just say this. Many times you probably bristle against this because of the poor job we as men have done in our culture of serving you. And on behalf of men, I want to apologize. I am so sorry of the abuses, of the words, of the actions, of the way that you've been treated, because it is not the way of Jesus, the great dignifier of women. And I believe marriage would be completely different if we as men step up. Aaron said this before. The breakdown in our culture has many times been the breakdown of family, and many times the breakdown of family has been men who bring a human life into the world but do not nurture that human life and love that human life. My wife and daughter got the opportunity to go to our Care Point through a global partnership down in Ecuador. And what broke my heart is to hear that the women run that village, that the men have run off to the city to let the kids raise themselves and to have the women do everything in that culture. They are running that culture. That is going to have effects on a culture. How would it be different, men, if we stepped up and served and sacrificed like our lives depend on it, because they do? The life in Christ that we've been given is to serve our wives. Now, for both men and women, let me just say parts of this might feel weird or might feel oppressive, might even feel aggressive to you, but it's actually the opposite. That in marriage, there's this beautiful example of grace. We come together, that the cord of three strands, the one that's already in our marriage before we enter, shows us a deep love and a deep generosity and a deep sacrifice, and models grace for us when we are so human and sinful and frustrating, and yes, sometimes we are annoying to one another, and God is in the middle of that. Now, let me tell you what this passage doesn't say. It doesn't say who the breadwinner is. It doesn't say how to structure our family. It doesn't say who the stronger leader is. And it doesn't say who takes care of certain family responsibilities at home. Here's what I believe. I believe that many times our view of marriage comes more from our culture than it does from God. Many times our view of marriage is more about 1950s sitcoms than it is about what the Bible actually says. And this is a ton to take in this morning. I encourage you, think through, pray through this passage. Let it kind of soak in to the crock pot of your soul slowly over time, over the next few months and weeks. This is very, very important. But here's one thing that I know is Satan hates 1+we marriages. Hates it. Loves to steal, kill, and destroy. John 10:10 says this, the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. But I, Jesus saying, I came that you may have life and life abundantly. Guys, what would abundant marriage look like? What would life-giving marriage look like? We have this picture of marriage in our culture that is bogus, that we're in it to get what we want. We're in it to get happiness. And I'm going to talk about some paradigm shifts we desperately need to make if we're going to come back to this idea of one, the living God, and we as a couple figuring out what that looks like. We have a lot of rewiring that we need to do. And Aaron introduced us to this book of Song of Songs, Song of Solomon. Maybe some of you guys read the Bible for the first time this week in a long time after you're like, I had no idea that was in there, right? But Aaron introduced you to this book, and there's this really cool phrase in there that I think is really important to us in marriage. I see it at work today, the idea of these little foxes. Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 15 says, the little foxes that ruin the vineyards are vineyards that are in bloom. Now, this idea of love and romance and marriage that's encapsulated in this book, it's the little things, guys. Even when it's the big things, even when I'm talking to somebody and there's something massive and catastrophic like an affair in their marriage, it started with the little things, if they're honest. It started in little ways. What are those little foxes? And I'm going to talk about 5 of these foxes in our marriage. Now, certainly there are more than these, but in many years of hearing people's marriages unfortunately fall apart, and many times, fortunately, God get in the middle of and heal them. Guys, there's hope for every marriage. Please hear that today. But Satan comes to steal, kill, and destroy the marriages that God has put together. So these 5 foxes I'm going to go through slowly. Little fox number 1 is utility. Utility. And you're like, what in the world? There's this idea that life can get really, really busy, and when it's busy and we get functional and we just sort of turn into the dad that feels like I'm just driving kids around all the time and like, was that a whole tank of gas? All I do is drive kids around this town anymore or go to work or do this thing. We can turn into task people, and 2 task people can be married together. And what's interesting is how many times we even drop the ball on those tasks. So ever left a kid before somewhere? You don't have to raise your hand. I know it's shameful. I have, right after I preached, right? Solid message this morning. Where's my kid? You know, this happens. So I think about sometimes I have to call my wife 6 or 7 times in the course of the day just to figure out what's going on this evening and how do we get this kid where, right? Life gets complicated. And I believe Satan wants us to live in just utility. We're roommates. And here's the crazy thing, like mind-blowing thing about marriage. Everything in terms of the actions of marriage, we can do not being married. Think about it. 2 non-married people can have sex regularly. 2 non-married people could raise kids. 2 non-married people can put a home together. 2 non-married people can, you name it, within marriage. And I see so many people who are technically married, like ring on their finger married, but who are not intimate, who are not having deep and hard conversations, who are not coming together over grace, who are not becoming what God designed for us married people to be. Now, this picture right here grieves me. And I think about maybe the ultimate expression of utility in many ways. Now, raise your hand if this has ever been you, okay? It's happened, right? It happens to us, right? No shame and guilt in that, but I just think the picture of this is a reminder that this is not what God built us for, so that we can answer emails next to each other for the rest of our lives, right? Or whatever we're doing, play some game on our phones. We are not playing a marriage game, guys. We are not just doing stuff as married people. God desires for us to have the intimacy of marriage. Dudes, let me say something to you as well. You should not be sharing your deepest thoughts with dudes over a beer at the bar. We need to be sharing our deepest thoughts with our wives. And let me start with this. Have you shared with your wife lately what your fears are? I don't know what's more intimate than that for us as dudes. What does that look like for instead of us to live out of utility, for us to live in intimacy. Guys, God designed us for intimacy in relationship. Little fox number 2 is scarcity. Scarcity. When we live in the scarcity mentality, opposite of abundance, of God giving freely, many times we think things like this. Well, that married couple has blank and we don't. Well, their husband has blank and my husband doesn't. That wife has blank and my wife doesn't. Things just got real, didn't they? And you're going, oh man, if you've ever filled in that blank, it's a scarcity mentality. It also tells you don't have enough time, you don't have enough energy. You can't invest in your marriage now. Maybe someday when you're an empty nester. And it breaks my heart to see empty nesters get to that phase that they should be enjoying the fruit of many years and realize that it ends in divorce because the kids are no longer there to hold them together. Guys, the kids are not designed to hold you together. The gospel is designed to hold you together, the good news of Jesus. When we trip over ourselves and when I realize, I'm more sinful than I think I was last week, the gospel's there to remind me many times through my wife that there is grace. Not a scarcity mentality, but abundance mentality. I'll remind you of this, guys. You always have enough to do what God has called you to do. Our first year of marriage, somewhere along the lines, one of the best decisions we made is to say every year for our anniversary, we're going to get away. Now, you say that when you're broke as a joke, and you're like, you're picturing like all-inclusive vacations, which happened once in a long while. You're picturing being at the hot springs, you're picturing perfection. What it actually ends up being is that one year where I have to call a camp and say, hey, it's our anniversary. We can't really afford anything else. Is there any way you could let us sleep here? It's the year when we go away and we had just adopted kids and we just couldn't leave them. And instead it turns into a family vacation at somebody's cabin for a couple nights. Or the time we call it camp again and our daughter was having a hard time, so she had to come with us. So it's not like perfect and rosy and what you had imagined, but the abundance mentality says God has given, and you know what? We are going to invest. And every investment is delayed gratification. Guys, healthy marriages don't get there on accident. Healthy marriages invest. Don't believe the scarcity mentality. What's true is if you never believe you have enough, you'll never go on a vacation. You'll never go on a date night. You'll never invest in each other. By the way, guys, Valentine's Day coming up. Make some plans. 14th. You're like putting that on your phone. You're scrambling. Oh, no, what's going on? Like, it doesn't have to be amazing. Invest. It doesn't have to be expensive. Invest. God has meant for us, an intention for us to invest. And by the way, guys, as we become the people God has designed us to be, some cool things happen. I love this quote from Bob Goff. He says, we often ask the question, who has God made me to be? But perhaps the more important question is, who is God making me into? Guys, who is God making your spouse into? We grow, we shift, we change. When you live in the abundance mentality, we ask, God, how are you growing me? How will I be different next year? Our marriage has a different texture than it did right when we got married and fell out of a plane and got engaged and had no idea what we were doing. Now we have half an idea what we're doing, right? We're getting there. Some of you guys are investing in one another and seeing one another grow in that. And I want to give just a special note to something as we think about there are all kinds of different tools, but God has used a tool in my wife and I's life called the Enneagram. You may be hearing about this on a secular note. I think we in the church really need to be teaching growth and personality and how God has wired us. And actually next Sunday night, we get the opportunity to invest in you guys with this tool called the Enneagram. It is one thing that we've realized, wow, I don't know how to invest in my wife's growth if I don't know how God has uniquely wired her. And this tool has gone beyond just helpful for us. There's all kinds of helpful stuff out there to healing. There's actually been healing in our lives in many ways to realize maybe God built me this way on purpose and you this way, and maybe this is how we can work together. So I love that Trace is going to invest in you guys, invest in married couples. You can sign up for that. Jump in. We'd love to spend next Sunday evening right here with you guys. So important to invest in one another. Next little fox is happiness. You're like, whoa, wait a minute. You don't want us to be happy? God doesn't want us to be happy? No, I want for there to be happy moments and joyful moments in your marriage. But here's the irony. If you set out to be happy in marriage, you will find yourself so unhappy it isn't even funny. How did I get here? If I set out to be this me and bring another person, drag another person along with me, somehow we just don't find it. What's interesting is what Gary Thomas says. I love this quote, but it rocks me to the core every time I hear it. Marriage does not exist to make us happy, but to make us holy. Not to make us happy, but to make us holy. And everything we see as you're planning a wedding is about happiness. And everything's going to be great and everything's going to be perfect. Here's the problem. You got two broken people and you got the toughness of life entering together. It's hard to be human. It's hard to be human. Two stories come together and there's brokenness and we forget, wait a minute. Maybe it's not just all roses along the way. And what grieves me, guys, is to see friends of mine who set it up for happiness, who didn't put God in the center of it, or somewhere along the way it slipped, and suddenly they feel like because I'm out of happiness, because I've fallen out of love, then something is gravely wrong, and they ditch the marriage, and it grieves me to the core. And let me be clear about this, guys. Life and marriage are grand adventures, but sometimes there are boring moments along the road. Like sometimes you just got to shop for groceries and drive your kids around 84 hours in a week and do the normal things of life. It's good, but there are those moments. Let me say this quote from Gary Thomas in a little bit of a different way. Marriage can refine us even when it doesn't excite us. It can refine us. It can make us into the people God has intended us to be. And remember, guys, especially men, Jesus has set this crazy example for us. That we would serve, that in that servanthood, in a strange way, we find the fulfillment, the joy as we serve and as we come together. And it's just the way God built it, but it's so counterintuitive. Chase happiness, and I can guarantee you're not going to find that. Chase love and generosity and self-sacrifice and servanthood, and you find something deeper than happiness, which is fulfillment. Little fox number 4 is fear. Guys, fear will eat our marriages alive. Some of you right now are living in fear of what they might do, what they might say, what might go wrong. And let me just say this. There are plenty of things from our past that can be haunting us in our marriages. I'm a huge fan of counseling. I love when couples do the work. They go into counseling and they say, there's some stuff in my life that I had no idea was there. And let me say, guys, every year that goes by in my life, I realize there's stuff in my life that I thought was normal that turns out it wasn't. My wife has this beautiful reminder. She tells me, Alan, the world is not like you. And I need that because I remember, oh yeah, there are different experiences. And do the work of counseling, but do the work of realizing, God, I have these fears that are crippling me from living a life of faith. Crippling me from that. Early in our marriage, I had to deal with one of my fears up front, which was finances. And I don't know how this fear crept into my story, but it was a big fear. My wife wasn't able to sleep through the night, and she came to me and said something we had talked about, but I thought was years ahead. She said, I think it's time for us to adopt. And we had talked about adopting multiple kids from another country, a serious endeavor. What I heard was very expensive endeavor in my mind. And so she kind of put this out in conversation as, hey, I want you to think about this and pray about this. Massive fear on me. Massive fear to think we are broke as a joke. We're living with her parents in their unfinished basement. Solid, right? Like definitely the level of respect that I wanted to be living into in that season, right? Yeah, like all my friends going, dude, you're living it up, right? Parents, in-laws basement, like worse than your parents' basement, the in-laws basement, no money to move out, and suddenly this really expensive thing called adoption, called parenthood, called the next season of life, I have to consider. And I'll tell you, I was racked with those fears, and I said, give me some time. And I'll be honest with you guys, I wasn't feeling it. God had put that initial call on my wife. Now, we talked about it years earlier. I thought, no, not now. Like, that's way in advance. I'm not ready to be a parent and all that. And I remember this moment in prayer where I thought, you know what? I know two things to be true. I trust my wife, and I trust my God who is leading my wife. And that's all that I needed. And let me just use this word, guys. I submitted to her passion, her faith, her calling. Because the fear of God came over me, and I thought, what if I stand in the way of my wife's faith on behalf of our family? Like, I will be held accountable for that. And in that moment, God invited me to choose faith over fear. I submitted to my wife, and it was one of the best decisions of my life. And the emotions catch up later. The emotions passed fear later, but it was so good for me in that moment to say, I trust God and I trust my wife. And in this moment, I'm going to give her the authority to make that first decision and enter that decision. And I have never regretted it. Really, really hard decision. But I've never regretted it. And guys, this is humbling men for just a second. We think many times we're going to bring our wives on this daring adventure. What's humbling to me is that the greatest adventures of my life have only come because I was married to Julie. The greatest adventures of my life have come through the faith of my wife, not through my own faith. That'll humble you. That'll remind us of the beauty of marriage. Again, 1 plus we grows, but me plus 1 shrinks. And we continue to grow and to innovate and to ask God, what do you have next for us? And in many ways, we have no idea, but we continue on that path. Little fox number 5 is blame. Some of you are living in the blame game right now. You are waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the other person to say that magic phrase, I told you so, or at least inside of your mind, or at least that look to shoot over to the other person. What if the grace could enter instead say, here's what God's doing in us. Not I told you so, but what's our next response to God in humility? Guys, life is hard. And many times marriage gets a bad rap for just life being hard. Our family went through something very, very difficult last year. And it wasn't our marriage's fault, but because it involved my wife and I and our family, we had to deal with it within our marriage. And so many times, hard human life coming together multiplies the dysfunction, but here's the beauty. It can also multiply the grace. When you feel like blaming, lean in to grace. And let me just say this. It doesn't mean we're supposed to make excuses for our spouse. If they're not living in a way God intended, continue to live that way. Live an example that way, but you're not to make excuses for the other person. And yet, take that person to God. Pray every single day, multiple times a day for that person. God, would you soften them? Would you use my example of love and self-sacrifice for them? I know this is not easy stuff, guys, and I don't pretend, yep, that's easy. That's the formula. But I want to give you these 5 paradigm shifts that we've gone over as we wrap up. 5 paradigm shifts that we need to rewire our marriages. Number 1, seek intimacy over utility. Seek intimacy over utility. God, how are you deepening me through this other person instead of just how are we supposed to do the tasks of life together? The next one is seek abundance over scarcity. To seek abundance over scarcity. God wants to give full life through Jesus, abundant life through Jesus, rich life through Jesus, not just an okay life and marriage or barely enough. God wants us to give generously. What if He gave so much to you in your life, in your family, in your marriage that it overflowed and other people got hope in their marriages because of your marriage? That's one of our prayers. That God, through our marriage, would you use it to stoke other people's flames for the marriage that they have? The next one, seek servanthood over happiness. Seek servanthood over happiness. What if God could rewire us that we would wake up in the morning and say, God, how can I serve my spouse? And when my spouse serves me, I'm reminded, whoa, that's the example of Jesus Himself in my life. Next one, seek faith over fear. Here's a bold and even blunt question today. What would it look like for you and your couple to seek something crazy in faith in this next season instead of just to live in fear? What would it seek for, or what would it look like for you guys to seek faith together? To say, God, what's the next thing? What's this crazy thing you want us to do that feels counterintuitive? giving something away or serving it away or doing something you say, oh, we could never do that. And never is a sure sign of scarcity in your life. Would God open you up to faith that leads to abundance, that leads to servanthood, that leads to intimacy? And the last one, guys, seek grace over blame. I'm going to bring it back to Jesus. When Jesus' life and love are manifest in our lives, it will feel a whole lot like the grace of God through us. Through us. I know what kind of dysfunction is in here. I know what kind of sin is in here. I know what kind of selfishness is in here. It's called a Saturday morning when I'm woken up way earlier than I had imagined, right? I know that. That's not supernatural. That's not amazing. What becomes amazing and supernatural is when God takes these broken vessels that we are and through us uses them to show grace to the world. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't want 2x the impact in this life. I want 100x. I want 1,000x the impact. And God has given us this tool called marriage for this. It's called a great mystery. We just read about it. I don't fully understand it, but all I know is that these two broken people together can show the image of Jesus. One of the most amazing moments, I think, of our marriage just happened months ago when my wife got a letter from her friend, Nate, in prison. And I know while I say that, some of you husbands are saying, are you kidding me? Are you okay with that? And I'm okay with you not being okay with that. Let me just say that because I trust my wife. I love my wife. And our friend Nate wrote from prison and he said, you have been Jesus to me, Julie. That is beautiful. And if we can enter that kind of adventure, and men, if we can spur our wives on and invite our wives into that by serving, by sacrificing, how amazing when we can see the image of God manifest in them. Guys, we need to move from me plus one to one plus we. What would that look like in your life? What would that look like in your life? And as we close, I just want to pray that prayer over you guys. Now, hope you guys join us next Sunday night right here. It's been an amazing tool. Julie and I get to share probably some embarrassing stories out of who we are and whatnot, but we get to share a way of saying, how has God wired my spouse for impact? How have you wired me for impact? And God, what would it look like to unleash that upon the world? That is truly a miracle. This great mystery that is Christ in the church, that is marriage, that is God manifesting his unlimited love through our limited lives and energy. Let me bring you back to that big idea, guys. A me plus one marriage will shrink, but a one plus me marriage will just keep growing. And if you guys don't mind, I'm going to pray a prayer over you guys today, because I know there's hard stuff going on in people's lives. I know there's issues. I know there's stuff I've said today that you bristle against, and it just doesn't fit with you. And I just want to pray a prayer that God would strengthen the marriages in this room and everyone who hears this on live stream and everyone who gets to experience this. God, thank you that you had this plan called marriage, this mystery, this miracle of how two broken people together, you fashion them through your grace into this instrument that the world can see. God, I thank you for every marriage that has impacted me. I thank you for my mom and my dad and for their marriage. Thank you for my grandpa and my grandma and their marriage. God, I thank you for generations ahead. I pray for the marriages that are under attack in this room, God. For the marriages that are wondering, is it just easier to throw in the towel and move separate directions? God, would you breathe some level of hope in this room today? Would you bring some paradigm shift can actually change the course of our lives and marriages for generations? I believe that you can do that, God. Bring healing, bring life. And God, would the marriages in this room be shown the grace that can then show the grace of your Son, Jesus, to the whole world? And all of God's people said, amen.